Stephen and Jeswendi Reed were shot and killed on the Marsh Loop Trail on April 18th of 2022, just before 3 p.m. You will learn that they left their apartment in Alton Woods and went for a walk. And you will learn that they never came home. And they never came home because the defendant, Logan Clegg, murdered them. After the defendant murdered Stephen and Jeswendi, who loved ones called Wendy, he dragged their bodies off the trail to conceal them so no one would find them. He concealed their bodies and covered them in layers of leaves, debris, and sticks. And after he murdered them, he ran and he hid. He left Concord right after having contact with investigators who were searching for Stephen and Wendy. He left Concord and was out of the state for multiple months. And despite efforts to conceal his murders, and despite efforts to conceal his tracks, investigators uncovered those tracks. And they found him in South Burlington, Vermont. And when he couldn't run or hide, he lied. He lied when investigators caught up with him. He claimed he wasn't in Concord on April 18th. He claimed he never heard of the alias Arthur Kelly, the name that he gave to investigators when they had contact with him when they started their missing person investigation. He claimed he never had a gun in Concord. And when investigators caught up with him and they found him, he had a 9mm handgun in his backpack. He had over $7,000 in cash. He had a fake Romanian passport and a one-way ticket to Berlin, Germany. During trial, you will hear about how after Stephen and Wendy were reported missing, investigators spent months trying to solve their murders. The investigation was extensive and thorough. They discovered the defendant's identity through surveillance footage and through various purchases that he had made using prepaid gift cards. When they discovered his identity, you will learn that he was on probation for felony convictions. During trial, you will see and hear evidence for yourselves that will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he is guilty of second-degree murder for killing Stephen and Wendy, and the other charges that you heard read today: felon in possession of a firearm and falsifying physical evidence for his efforts to conceal the murders that he committed. As you heard in jury selection, motive is not an element of the crimes charged. The elements are what you will hear presented during this trial. The state is required to prove that the defendant knowingly shot and killed Stephen and Wendy Reed. The evidence you will hear will show what happened to Stephen and Wendy and how they were shot and killed on the Marsh Loop Trail, and how the defendant is the one and only person who committed those murders. By the end of trial, you will know beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant, Logan Clegg, is the one and only person who was responsible for the murders of Stephen and Wendy. The evidence in this case will show that the defendant murdered Stephen and Wendy, that he dragged and concealed their bodies, that he ran after having contact with investigators who were searching for Stephen and Wendy. He hid out of state in South Burlington, Vermont. He attempted to flee the country, and when he was finally caught, he lied. On April 18th of 2022, Stephen and Wendy went out for a walk near their apartment complex. Stephen's last known communication with family was around 11 a.m. that morning. When Stephen didn't show up 2 days later on the 20th for a regular tennis match, family members became concerned. It was unusual for Stephen not to show up and not to communicate. And you'll learn that Sue Forey, Stephen's sister, went to their apartment complex to check on them. They lived in Alton Woods on Loudon Road here in Concord. They lived in apartment 1411, so building 14. Stephen and Wendy's cars were out front when Sue Forey showed up. They weren't home. Their house was orderly. Their personal belongings were still home. Car keys, cash, wallets, Wendy's cell phones. What you'll learn is Stephen's cell phone was not home. It was not at the apartment. On April 20th of 2022, Sue Forey contacted the police. Members of the Concord Police Department and New Hampshire State Police started a missing person investigation to search for Stephen and Wendy. That same evening, so the 20th of April of 2022, while investigators are out searching nearby areas, nearby Alton Woods, they come across a tent nearby, near their Marsh Loop Trail. In this top area of this wooded area. And the blue is Stephen and Wendy's apartment. And they came across this tent, and they found a man in that tent. That man was a white man in his 20s or 30s. He had brown hair, and he was clean shaven. Investigators noticed around his tent many Mountain Dew cans. They spoke with that man, and he claimed his name was Arthur Kelly. He claimed that he was from Boston, Massachusetts. He was told that they were looking for Stephen and Wendy. He said he didn't see anyone else around. And investigators left the tent site, and they continued to search for Stephen and Wendy. You will learn that Stephen and Wendy's bodies were found dragged off the Marsh Loop Trail. The following day, on April 21st of 2022. Using location data from Stephen's cell phone and with the help of a canine, they were able to find Stephen and Wendy. Their bodies were concealed in the woods. They were covered by sticks and leaves and debris. Only a small portion of Wendy's head and her hair was even visible once the canine helped them locate them. Stephen and Wendy both had gunshot wounds, multiple gunshot wounds. Wendy had 2 shots to her head and her neck. Fragments were later from those bullets able to be recovered. Stephen had multiple shots to his left hand, his left arm, his shoulder, neck area, and his back. Fragments from the bullets were able to be recovered. And autopsy results, which are the external and the internal examination of their bodies by the medical examiner, revealed that they died from gunshot wounds. After killing Stephen and Wendy, the defendant dragged their bodies off the trail down to the place where he ultimately concealed them. You will learn that investigators found blood and bullet fragments on the trail. Along the path between the trail and where Stephen and Wendy's bodies were found, a bloody pill bottle and a ripped portion of Wendy's green pants were found. The blood was Wendy's blood. During various searches over the course of the investigation, investigators later found shell casings at the crime scene, and shell casings at a location later discovered to be the defendant's burnt tent site. The day after Stephen and Wendy's bodies were found, so the following day, April 22nd of 2022, a woman named Nan Nutt came forward. Nan had described being on the Marsh Loop Trail on the same day as Stephen and Wendy, so the 18th. She recalled who she later learned was Stephen and Wendy were on the trail at the same time. She arrived at the Portsmouth Street, so Nan Nutt arrived at the Portsmouth Street parking lot, which you will see on today's view. She arrived at about 2:45 p.m. on the 18th. She started her hike with her two dogs. It was about 2:48 p.m. And what you're seeing on the screen are screenshots from Nan Nutt's cell phone tracking her hike. When Nan Nutt arrived at the Marsh Loop Trail, she recalled letting the couple walk past her. She and her dogs were going much slower. And she described that the couple that she saw appeared to know each other. They were having a conversation, and they appeared to be wearing clothing consistent with hiking. About 5 minutes later, Nan Nutt hears multiple gunshots. Gunshots that were further into the woods than she was. She thought that it sounded like a handgun, not a rifle. Initially, she didn't know what to make of it, contemplating that it wasn't hunting season. Ultimately, she decided to keep walking and hiking with her dogs. So she continues on with her hike. And as she continues on, she sees a man. A man who was looking off the trail in a direction that you will learn was in the direction that Stephen and Wendy's bodies were later found. The man Nan Nutt saw was a white man in his 20s or 30s. He had brown hair. He was clean shaven. He was wearing a blue sweatshirt or jacket and a black backpack. And he was carrying a brown grocery bag. Nan Nutt recalled the brown grocery bag having some type of cylindrical object in it. She wasn't quite sure what it was, but it was some type of cylindrical object. She didn't have any communication with this man. He kept walking in the opposite direction of her, and she kept going in her hike. She looked back, to get a better look at him. And when she did, he was staring at her. She kept on her hike, and she left with her dogs. A few minutes later into her hike, she approached a different, older gentleman. They exchanged some words, and they both continued on their hike. Nan continued her hike until about 3:39 p.m., when she left the Portsmouth Street parking lot. With the information from Nan Nutt, investigators spent months combing through surveillance footage and receipts from nearby stores, trying to conduct multiple searches of the scene and nearby areas. You will learn during the course of trial that the defendant was living in a tent nearby. Circling the profile area on the Marsh Loop Trail map that you're seeing. When investigators went to the location of the defendant's tent, they found debris of a burnt tent site, consistent with someone living there for months. In the burnt tent site, investigators located shell casings, burnt grocery bags, Mountain Dew, along with burnt clothing. They also found about 150 mini burnt propane tanks. Investigators searched the closest located retail stores that would sell Mountain Dew and mini propane tanks. And investigators discovered receipts for almost all 150 propane tanks that they found, all purchased by Logan Clegg, the defendant. You'll learn that the defendant purchased propane tanks all winter in Concord. Investigators located months of surveillance footage capturing the defendant at Walmart on Loudon Road in Concord. The day after Stephen and Wendy were murdered, so April 19th of 2022, the defendant entered Walmart at about 9:40 a.m. He purchased a tent, a sleeping bag, and rubbing alcohol. You will learn that the same person who spoke with investigators and claimed to be Arthur Kelly was identified as the defendant, Logan Clegg. Investigators also found surveillance footage of the defendant on the day of the murders, just shortly before the murders. He was captured on cameras at Shaw's in Loudon Road, which you'll see today, is just a short walk. The Shaw's is at the bottom of the screen, and the Marsh Loop Trail is here. The defendant was seen at the Shaw's just before 2:30 p.m. at that Shaw's. In the surveillance footage, a white man in his 20s or 30s. He was wearing a dark blue jacket or sweatshirt, carrying a black backpack, and a brown grocery bag. Just before Stephen and Wendy were murdered. You will learn that when he left Shaw's, he walked in the direction of where Stephen and Wendy were murdered on the Marsh Loop Trail. These are all locations that you will see later today. The defendant ran after having contact with investigators. Just hours after having spoken to investigators who said that they were searching for Stephen and Wendy, hours after, he lied that he was Arthur Kelly. The defendant created an email account the morning of April 21st of 2022. That morning, he created a Gmail account, dentkelly0707@gmail.com. What you will learn is that he used that Gmail account to purchase a bus ticket out of Concord using another fake name, Denton Kelly. The defendant took a bus and got out of Concord, and he ran away from his crimes. A couple days later, when investigators went back to the tent site where they had encountered the man who claimed to be Arthur Kelly, they found no tent, no debris, no Mountain Dew cans, no trace of a tent. Over the next few months, the defendant continued to run. You will learn that he purchased a Greyhound bus ticket, a bus ticket that was scheduled to leave on May 15th of 2022 from Boston, Massachusetts to Burlington, Vermont. And when he did that, he used the alias Arthur Kelly and the Gmail account dentkelly0707@gmail.com. The defendant hid out of state and he attempted to flee the country. In October of 2022, investigators learned that the defendant, using the name Logan Clegg, had purchased a plane ticket, a one-way plane ticket from JFK Airport to Berlin, Germany. The flight was scheduled to leave in a few days. In this information, in this purchase, the defendant used a phone number that you will learn was tied to the email account firstpeterblack@gmail.com. Yet another alias and another email account. The defendant's flight was scheduled to leave on October 14th of 2022 from JFK to Berlin, Germany. Investigators obtained location information for that phone number, and location information revealed that it was believed to be in South Burlington, Vermont. You will learn that investigators traveled to South Burlington, Vermont, and they located the defendant outside a local grocery store, Price Chopper, where he had been working. And when they located him, they followed him to the public library. At the public library, he was using his laptop. He had with him a black backpack. Investigators made contact with him, secured his backpack, secured the laptop, and in the backpack they found a 9mm handgun. A handgun that he purchased using the name Arthur Kelly. A handgun that he purchased on February 12th of 2022 in Vermont. In the defendant's backpack, they also found a fake passport with his photo on it, which had been mailed to him at Arthur Kelly in Vermont. You will learn that bullets fired from the defendant's 9mm handgun in his backpack were consistent in caliber and class characteristics as bullet fragments found during autopsy. The shell casings from the crime scene at the trail and the defendant's burnt tent site were sent to the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory for ballistics testing. The analysis determined that those casings were fired from the defendant's 9mm handgun. When investigators searched the defendant's laptop, they found the same photograph that was used on his fake Romanian passport. They also found that he had conducted multiple Windows 10 procedures known as a fresh start. So just hours after having been questioned by the investigators who were searching for Stephen and Wendy, and he lied about being Arthur Kelly, he conducted fresh starts of his computer on April 21st of 2022. You will learn that a fresh start is a procedure that effectively wipes browser history, among other things. What limited search history available on his laptop revealed, search is consistent with traveling out of the country. And he also searched Concord NH News. He searched Concord NH News that same morning that investigators had contact with him, October 12th of 2022. When the defendant was finally caught, he lied. Investigators conducted an interview of him on October 12th of 2022. During the interview, he claimed he was not in Concord on April 18th of 2022. He claimed that he had left Concord in February or March. He claimed he didn't use a tent while in Concord. He claimed that he didn't stay in the wooded area near Alton Woods or the wooded area along the Marsh Loop Trail. He even denied knowing the name Arthur Kelly. He denied having a gun. And you will learn that despite being confronted with the information that investigators had learned over the months-long investigation, the defendant continued to try to conceal his murders. In the end, it doesn't matter what you call him. Arthur Kelly, Denton Kelly, Peter Black. What you will know at the end of trial is that he is all the same person, Logan Clegg. The same one and only person who is responsible for the murders of Stephen and Wendy Reed. The one and only person who shot and killed them on the Marsh Loop Trail. The one and only person who concealed their bodies and dragged them off the trail so no one would find them. The one and only person who burned his tent site, wiped information from his laptop, and bought a one-way ticket out of the country. After the defendant murdered Stephen and Wendy, he tried to run and hide. And when he couldn't run or hide anymore, he lied. The end of trial, we are going to ask you to find him guilty. Guilty of the crimes that he committed. Being a felon in possession of a gun, falsifying evidence for concealing Stephen and Wendy's bodies, burning his tent site, wiping his laptop, and murdering Stephen and Wendy Reed.